Hello, we're so glad that you joined us for a walk in the garden. I'm Patty Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome to gardeners across the United States and to our international guests. As we continue to cope with the challenges of the coronavirus, we hope that these weekly virtual garden walks will add a bit of beauty to your day and inspire you to visit, create, and enjoy gardens in your area whenever you can. Today I'd like to introduce Christie Dustman, whose garden walk will guide us through planting design considerations. Christie Dustman is a nationally certified landscape designer, lifelong gardener, and lover of plants, people, and outdoor spaces. For more than 2 decades, her company has designed, installed, and maintained hundreds of bold yet detailed gardens in the Boston area. Often featuring conifers as living sculptures, Christie's gardens become living works of art. Welcome, Christie.
Thank you. Okay, so we're ready to get started today. So my name is Christie Dustman, and I am a landscape designer. I have my own firm in the Boston area. My website is Christie Dustman and Company. So getting started today, really what my goal is to talk about plants and planting design. And the thrust of what I'm trying to say today to you is that plants, when appreciated for their shape and form, are the crucial building blocks of landscapes. You'll notice that my photos, I have done a fair amount of traveling, so I do try to include some interesting photos from different places around the world, and also some of our own design work from my office. So in my mind, plants are more than just their simplistic characteristics that we often see advertised in garden magazines, catalogs. You'll see that the flower is awesome, the leaf is awesome, the fall color is awesome, the fragrance is awesome. So we're often seeing that plants have been reduced to a very simplistic single characteristic. And my contention is that plants really are much more than that. They're a living and breathing object that add the garden to an outdoor space. So I realize that this looks like a very simplistic representation of an umbrella, and I apologize for that with my graphics. But in my mind, when I think about design, I think about that design principles really are the overarching set of guidelines that help us with both planting beds and outdoor built elements and spatial design, such that the plantings, the outdoor elements, and the spatial design looks coherent, unified, in scale, in proportion, and visually pleasing. So these design principles, we keep them in mind when we're designing functional and practical layout of the outdoor space, and when we're selecting plants that can serve functions and offer beauty. So when I think about planting design, I'm thinking about how do I use our well-known and well-loved design principles that guide all landscape design, and they guide plant design. And for me, the way that they help to guide plant design is because I think of plants as shapes. So we're going to talk about some well-known design principles that I have listed here for you, and how they help to guide the combination of different plant shapes to create a cohesive and pleasing planting design. So first of all, thinking about the most simplistic, the most basic design principle, which is to appreciate line. And, you know, lines create our visual environment. When you see the two examples that I have here on the right-hand side, you see how having very rectilinear lines creates a certain set of shapes and possibly inspires a certain feeling inside of you when you look at that, versus on the bottom, you see this curvaceous, these curvy lines kind of gives you a whole different set of shapes and potentially a different feeling inside when you see that. So for me, line is such a critical part of design because it defines space by enclosing it, and it creates shapes. And for me, when I'm looking at these two examples on the screen, the way that my eye interacts with these two visuals, my eye actually traces the lines. So I've become very aware of how my eyes interact with what I'm seeing. And that's part of what I'm considering when I'm combining shapes for planting designs. What are the shapes going to, how are my eyes going to interact with those shapes? Is it going to be dynamic, or is it going to be very static and jumpy and chaotic? Because lines really do define our visual world. If you can't see the lines, you're not really going to be able to see anything clearly. Just talk to someone in their 50s like me who needs readers for everything. Without my glasses, I'm really lost. So lines define forms and shapes. Lines bound shapes. So here we have vertical shapes, the use of tree trunks, really creating those visual lines in a planting or in a more natural wooded setting. Lines create shapes. So here I have similar shapes, but very different environments and very different plants. So you see there's a similarity between the big rounded leaves of the hosta on the left-hand side and the rounded petals of the cactus on the right-hand side, and the very spiky leaves on both of those other plants. So lines create shapes. Lines have energy. So if you look at this, I'm looking up into a pruned pine in Japan, where it has been needle plucked and cultivated and shaped and trained over many years. And I find that my eyes tend to trace the lines of those branches in a very energetic kind of a way. So plant lines add movement and visual energy to a garden. So here are two examples of white flowering plants. You have a wisteria on the right-hand side, and I'm not sure what it is on the left, but on one side, the plant and the plant lines are giving an upward movement, and on the right-hand side, kind of drawing you down. So again, that use of line, that use of a plant as a shape. Think about the movement of grasses in the wind. So grasses are big collections of lines. Hedges are living lines. Here they really define your view and they contain you. Like you see here, this is an aerial view of Sissinghurst Castle, which you definitely would have an interesting experience being inside of those very tall hedges, which are plants carved into lines. Hedges are plants with a purpose. They can define what's inside and what's outside. And plant lines add movement by directing your eye. So this is an example of a part of my own personal garden. You see I have a blue atlas cedar that I have trained to meet the roof of my garden shed. And at this point, now a couple years past this photo, I now have the leader of that conifer is being trained across the front of the shed. But when I look at this, my eye kind of glides up and glides back along the top rib of that conifer. So what I'm suggesting really is that a plant is much more than a particular characteristic. It really is a living form that is bounded by lines. So I am reducing plants to one of their most basic characteristics, but I think it's the most fundamental characteristic to be considered. So are we talking about a living mound, a living globe, a living pyramid, a living cylinder? There's so many different shapes and growth habits of plants. And for any of you that know me, I am kind of a conifer, a crazed conifer person. And so you'll see that I'm going to start using conifers as my examples, but this just happens to be a planting that I saw when driving around. And I'm not saying that it's a great planting, but it really, you can see very clearly that these plants offer various shapes. And they are various shapes that are combined in this particular planting. And I've kind of outlined, you have roundy, you have pyramid, you have upright, you have low and squatty. So the plant's form really, to me, is the critical characteristic, the most basic, important characteristic when designing planting beds. And those plant forms are the building blocks of garden beds. And they're augmented by these other characteristics like color, texture. If you're thinking about perennials, possibly flower, fall color. But when I'm thinking about designing a planting bed, if I'm going to use a peony, for instance, which I don't use very much, but say it just comes to mind, if I was going to use a peony, I need to think about the shape of the plant. I can't just think about what that flower is going to look like. I have to appreciate that the flower is stuck onto a plant. And then how does that plant fit into the larger context of the overall garden bed? So for me, in my design work, I do use a lot of conifers because they offer a lot of plant shapes. They offer a lot of textures and colors, much more of a varied range than you might think. So let's just take a look at some of the shapes of conifers. So the Conifer Society, which I'm a member of, has categorized conifer shapes so that there are words that describe the various shapes and habits of different conifers. And these shapes also apply to other non-conifer plants. So, you know, globose, mounding, narrowly upright, prostrate. So if you think about plants, they don't just, in my mind, when I think of a plant, I think of what it's going to look like. I think of what its shape is. All the way through spreading to culturally altered, so things that are pruned or trained. I don't know if anyone has been to Green Animals in Rhode Island, but here's a photo of that in the left. So you have prostrate, spreading plants. And you notice the different colors, the different textures. You have weepers or irregular. Here's an amazing public garden, Innisfree in the Hudson Valley. Look at all of these weeping Norway spruce that are combined in such just a magnificent use of their shapes. Tall, skinny evergreens or plants really serve as an anchor. for me, doing a lot of work in smaller city gardens, I like upright, skinny plants as a way of taking advantage of vertical space where there's limited horizontal space. This is a private garden that I toured with the American Conifer Society, and really simple use of plant material. You have very tight arborvitae. They're probably DeGroote spire. You have Calamagrostis. You have some lavender, and such an amazing use of plants, thinking about their shape and their form and how they're combined in a very striking way. There's pyramidal, twisty and sculptural. So I do often think of conifers as living sculptures, and you can see that quality in these plants in this particular slide. Globose, cushion or bun shaped. This is a garden that I toured in Ireland. And when I look at this, I'm not really even thinking about what are those particular plants. I'm really just so awestruck by the effort to have made these plants truly into very defined, bounded shapes. And here is a trained larynx to love. This is a garden that I toured in the Syracuse area of New York last year. I'll show you another picture of this garden, which is kind of like going to Disney. But can you see that this larynx here, larch, has been trained as an elephant? So plants can be animals, animal shapes. Here's azaleas at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Look how they've been clipped into, just looks like, to me, giant ho-hos. So differently shaped plants have their own texture and color and other possible secondary characteristics. This is a shot of my own backyard. But I think sometimes what ends up happening to us, and I think this can be particularly true for homeowners that are looking at plants, is that we can get kind of lost in the close-up photos. So the close-up photos of the foliage, of the texture, of the flower, of the leaf. We can zoom into these amazing close-up photos of a particular, small bit of the plant and lose the overall context of, okay, that's lovely, but what does the plant actually look like? What is the shape of the plant? Because it's the shape of the plant that is going to need to work with all of the other shapes, such that the whole vignette reads well. And then within that, you have these extra bonuses, the foliage color and the texture. So we're not florists. We're not picking a plant so that we can cut off 12 inches of it and put it in a vase. We're planting the entire plant in a garden. So for me, I feel like I have to mentally and visually zoom in and zoom out of, okay, this is a close-up of the foliage. This is a close-up of the color. This is something that I really like about this plant up close, but then I have to zoom back and consider what the overall shape and habit of the plant is itself. So color is certainly a secondary characteristic that is important. But again, just picking something for the color and not thinking about what the shape is of the plant can lead to planting design that does not appear cohesive. So I think there was a day for me, and I still do think about color palettes. And when I first started designing, I would actually pick a photo of the colors that I wanted to use and continually refer to that when I was building out my planting lists. But for me, more and more what I'm thinking about is that, the color really can be overemphasized in garden design. And last year I went on a tour in the Netherlands and on the western part of Germany, looking at gardens designed by Pete Oudoff. And you'll see his quote here: "By seeking to base planting design on structure, it will become apparent that there is something more essential to the soul of plants than color." So really, he and other people have started to move us away or give us options to move away from the color-themed beds to thinking about planting based on complementary forms and shapes. So here I'm showing two different gardens, one of longwood gardens where you're looking at planting beds that are filled with primarily annuals that get changed several times a year. That's really based on primarily on color, versus on the right-hand side, there is certainly color has been considered, but there's also shape, and thinking about the use of complementary and contrasting shapes to the actual flowers and the actual plants. So combining colorful shapes in a pleasing way, or just combining shapes in a pleasing way, how do we start to do that? And that's where we go back to our friends, the design principles. So with the understanding that, for me, unified, coherent, and a planting plan that really works, I'm selecting plants, thinking about their shapes, and how do I make them, how do I make it all come together in a pleasing fashion? So I'm thinking about these other design principles such as repetition, massing, rhythm, scale, proportion, proximity, and a term that I use, dynamic juxtaposition. So we've already talked about line and form, and those very essential design principles are what create those shapes that we're now working with and trying to figure out how do we combine them. So repetition of color is a way of visually linking plants, giving rhythm to a planting. So this is a nursery that I visited in England, and you can see there is repetition, for instance, of red foliage plants, of plants that have some yellow in it. You have different shapes and forms that seem to repeat within this combination. So repetition of color is a way of linking plants. Repetition of the same plant is a way of visually linking the plants in a garden. So here are two examples. I did not work on either of these two gardens. I just happened to take pictures of them, but I think that it's an interesting comparison. You see on the right-hand side, you have three of these heuchera, maybe it's heuchera caramel or something like that. And to me, there is a repetition. There's three of them, so I would say there's A for effort. But because they're planted with such space between them, to me, they kind of look like they're waiting for a bus, or maybe with social distancing, maybe they need to actually be a little farther apart. But on the left-hand side, same plant, but because they're planted within a context and they're planted closer to each other, that repetition does help to kind of pull this little planting on the corner together. So let's not do this. Plants do need to be friends with each other. Here there is a repetition of a lot of little moundy, roundy, tiny little guys. This is a conifer collector's garden, and you can see that for some folks that get into collecting, collections become really just a collection, just planting of specimens in a bed without the greater context or the greater sense of design as the guide. So let's not do this, but let's think about repetition of plant shapes as being dynamic or static. So the picture on the left, I just took off the internet, and there certainly is a repetition of the little round boxwoods. There's a repetition of the square stepping stones. And to me, this does seem dynamic. My eye traces the circle. It's visually engaged along the axis. So the repetition of a really limited palette of items is effective if this is what you're looking for on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, this is a series of arborvitae that every year, I don't know if it's a company or if the homeowner carefully clips off the top of it, but it's a pretty static row of these arborvitaes that I caught with a little bit of snow on them. So when you're repeating plant shapes, is it in a way that your eye enjoys kind of bouncing between the plants, or is it something that just feels boring? This is an interesting garden that I saw on Long Island that will probably never be replicated by anyone else ever. These are all ginkgo trees that have been pollarded, the ends of their branches. So you see that the poof of the foliage at the ends of the branches makes these kind of round balls. And then you have these clipped boxwood round balls at the bottom. So just a really out there use of repetition of shapes. And is it static, or is it dynamic, or is it just plain weird? So going along with repetition is the idea of massing. So really using a multiple of one plant to create a sense of unity. So this is up at Bedrock Gardens in Lee, New Hampshire, and you see the use of the Hackanachoa grass massed along the edge as a way of kind of pulling together that bed, and also giving a sense of a line and a sense of direction to that walkway. So massing, here's a roof at the Getty Museum, and to me, the cactus have a lot in common with what I love about conifers. They're very strong architectural and geometric shape. And, for a tip for me when doing massing is to overlap the edges of the masses. So you see that some of these upright guys have jumped in amongst these barrel cactus, and some of the little barrel cactus have jumped in amongst these little blue guys. So the idea of kind of feathering the edges of the masses so that they seem linked rather than static groups that have no relationship to each other. So again, looking at this composition here, really very strong use of shape and color as the building blocks for how the plants were selected. This is a garden that I saw in England, and to me it just is so striking from the point of view of massing and repetition and the use of color and high color contrast, visually linking all of these plants in this garden. So another thing that I think about, and I'm sure that you do too, is the idea of layering, that you want to plant a ground layer, middle shrub layer, tree canopy. Just the idea of having layering in a garden as a way of visually unifying all of the plants, and often to perform a function. Sometimes we're looking at those taller plants, particularly in a city garden, as a way of achieving maybe some privacy or adding shade. So layering is another important guiding design principle when you're thinking about which shapes to use and how to combine them. Layering here in the garden. So scale is important when you think about shapes and plants and how they relate to each other. So proportion, you know, what's the relationship between one piece and the whole? You know, what's the relationship between one plant and the gestalt of the rest of the plants? Because I think the goal, at least for me as a designer of residential gardens, for the most part, I want to think about what does it feel like to be a human in that garden. So I don't know how many have traveled or have had the opportunity to go to the Imperial Palace in China, but for me, the sense there was that I was quite small in relationship to all of the massive architecture. And for me, when I'm creating a garden, that's not the experience that I want to replicate. So for scale, I do consider these 5 questions. So the plants, are they too big or too small as they relate to their surroundings? This photo on the left-hand side was a property that I loved driving by, and you know, just knowing that at one point all of those spruce probably looked really adorable at the foundation, and now, you know, have done what they're supposed to do, which is get bigger and taller and wider, such that you can't even get through the door. So are they too big? Yes, I think we could categorically say these guys are too big and it's too late. That ship has sailed. They need to be removed. This is a traffic island near where I live, and just looking at the size of that U as compared to a human and a dog. So sometimes friends have to ask friends if something is too big, because we can lose perspective on our own properties. You know, is the plant too big or too small when compared to the surrounding? So looking at these 2 cherry trees, the one on the right, I would say, is just absolutely magnificent and perfect with that house. The one on the left looks forlorn and lost and has a painful mulch volcano at the bottom. I just drove by and took this picture. I did not do this with it, but it does have the tag, so we'll always know what it is. So this, on the left-hand side, I would say that the plant needs to be captured in the planting bed and have some friends around it. It also may be too close to the building, but in terms of thinking about scale, you know, you want to think about ultimately the plants that you've selected, the shapes that the plants have, how are they going to work over time in relation to the surrounding? You know, I would venture to say that the yews here and the hemlock hedges here at this estate are perfect. They're enormous. They would be way out of scale in a smaller context, but they work very well given the scale of this particular property. So this is a new was a new build and obviously new landscape in order to put up the for sale sign. I happened to be biking by it and I just took a picture because, you know, this I think is a common problem that we see, which is that, first of all, the planting beds are so close to the house that you really can't get enough depth in the planting bed to have the size and the size variation of plants to make a meaningful and more robust looking planting bed planting. And just like this looks like a dogwood stuck here in the middle of the lawn in a little island. And, you know, given the house, maybe say the house is $1.5 million, and this tree is, you know, $150. So, you know, to have started out with a bigger tree, to have the tree be in scale with the house, to have the planting beds be wide enough such that you could really have some variation of sized and shaped plants, as well as just the reality that the planting beds here just are all stuck up against the house rather than somehow reaching into the yard itself. Many problems with this, but primarily I wanted to show it as an example of looking at the size of the plants and how they relate to the size of the house. And is it pleasing, or does it look like it's unfinished and just not right? So here is my comment about that. If the planting beds are too narrow, you can't get enough plant mass into the beds to ground the house. So the size of the plants, the mass of the plants, are the plants too short or too tall? This is a very interesting way of trying to get some privacy with this house on the corner of a busy, with a busy street light. Here you have these birch that certainly when they have leaves on really do provide a lot of privacy for that house. And even in the winter, I think just give a little bit of a baffle, a sense of some separation from the street. I think this is a very interesting use of a grove of trees in a city, small city situation that's quite effective. So the design tip being bringing your design beds out 2/3 to 1-to-1 ratio of the height of the house. The goal being to balance the weight of the house with the weight and the mass of the garden on the land. So thinking about plant quantity, are there too many or too few plants for the space? So this is a garden that I toured on the left-hand side in Ireland, which has a really quite an amazing meadow type garden, kind of a free-for-all. You know, and we could argue, is it overplanted, underplanted, or is it just perfect given the setting and kind of having some chaos with this amazing you know, structure of the house in the background. The one on the right is a picture I took off the internet, and I just was really struck by it because I see the use of plants. You know, here the plants really do read as shapes, but they're also far apart that it looks lonely, or it looks like only day one of the installation has been completed. And it kind of looks like if you closed your eyes and opened your eyes, all of the plants would have run around and landed in different spots. Red light, green light, if you remember that kids game. So I think we're trying to strive for an adequately and well-intentioned, ethically planted planting bed where plants are not going to immediately need to be, you know, controlled, but that the plants do look like they're friends with each other, and that it's satisfying. So proximity, when you're thinking about scale, what is the proper spacing between plants? So on the left-hand side is a garden that I designed the structure that you're seeing in the front there. The garden owner is an avid gardener who is just the most amazing gardener ever, with all of these annuals and roses, and just really amazing. And I think we could safely say that the roses on the left-hand side appear to have been better spaced than in the botanical garden that I have a photo of on the right-hand side, where again the plants just look like they've been planted as individuals rather than as part of a knit group. So what is the right spacing of plant shapes? So proximity, again, that measure of closeness between different items. This is another picture of my own backyard, and you see how my interest in plants as shapes and stones and other kinds of shapes really influence the kind of planting and gardens that I design myself. So recap for scale with plants. Are the plants too big or too small in terms of the proportion to the overall site? The width of the planting beds, how do they relate to the site? The height of the plants as they relate to potentially the height of the house or other surrounding features. Is it over or under planted? And the proximity, the closeness of the plants to each other. So this design principle of scale, when you're thinking about planting design, is so important because planting design is combining shapes, and we want them to be effective. Now, I mentioned this term dynamic juxtaposition, and I don't know if it's an official term, but it's a term that I use where you pair two contrasting materials or textures or shapes for an energized effect. So for instance, this is a pond in a patio that I designed on the left-hand side. So you have this organic form punched into a stayed bluestone patio. So you have that contrast, that tension between those shapes and those materials. Or on the right-hand side, you have the little upturned nose of the weeping Norway spruce with that rock, the boulder. So you have a conversation between those two elements in a way that to me feels energized rather than feeling just boring and one-dimensional. Dynamic juxtaposition in nature. So this was something that I saw at Volcanoes National Park on the island of Hawaii. The colonizing fern that is coming in to this lava flow. What an amazing contrast on so many levels, and so engaging. This at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, looking down and seeing this stone statue with a silk wrap and a silk parasol, surrounded by all of the stone. Just such an amazing juxtaposition and so energizing and engaging. And how can we bring that into the garden by combining shapes in ways that really have an energizing visual impact. The tension between loose and rigid. This is a garden, one of the gardens that I saw on the tour in the Netherlands last year. Obviously, there's no bunnies here. There was more echinacea than you could shake a stick at. But for me, I'm just so enamored with combining those rigid shapes of those upright yews with the lush looseness of the planting beds. Such an amazing tension that is so engaging. Here's an example of the cardoons with these just prehistoric looking foliage highlighted against the clipped hedge at the New York Botanic Garden. Perhaps a little messy, but this is one of my favorite places to drive by. I don't know if you do this, but I have certain properties that I look at every time I drive by, and I have like a little tutorial that I give the homeowner in my own mind. So you have these this perfect use of white pine right up against the house, you know, aiming to be 100 feet tall, and then the dwarf Alberta spruce, you know, very tight shape, all held inside of the kennel by the 5 or 6 foot metal fence, so they don't run into the road. You know, so is this an example of dynamic juxtaposition? Is this kind of a horticultural joke? But I mean, I guess it is, but there's some other problems happening there. So focal points. I think for most of us, we would consider focal points to be a design must. It is a convention of design, and I think, at least for me, when I'm thinking about planting beds, I do often think about where's the primary view of this planting bed, and how can I put something in that spot that I can then organize plants around, or even organize the rest of the bed around, such that the rest of the garden bed is subordinate to that element. It becomes the focus. And oftentimes for me, that focal point is a shape. The focal point is that nexus point of the planting bed. So here is a garden that I designed where the red bud already existed. So the rest of the garden kind of worked in around that red bud. And if you're wondering, yes, I did have to pick the plants to match the paint colors on the house. So focal points could be a plant or an object or a built feature. It is kind of the anchor of the space. So this is that garden that I was mentioning that we toured last fall, kind of a Disneyland. And there was a way in which it was just phenomenal in this collection of all of these shapes, but there was no focal point. Everything was vying for attention, such that this is the photo on the bottom I took from inside the house looking out the window. And if you didn't know better, you might think that this is a picture of a nursery where each one of those plants is just waiting to be taken home. But in fact, it is this person's private garden. And they spend every day, basically all year, manicuring all of these plants. But it's an interesting, kind of going to the far end of the spectrum of thinking about plants as shapes. But I would say in this situation, shape has been taken too far to the point where the shapes actually don't really seem related to each other. They seem separate. This was on a tour with the Conifers Society in Syracuse, New York. This is a Japanese white pine that I watched this arborist was pruning it and just what an amazing focal point. Like if we could all have something so, just so awe-inspiring. So certainly the idea of focal points, the idea of actually framing the focal point. Here it is with a structure. This is entering the Miho Museum in Japan. And walking into this museum, you see that there's multiple ways that those pines in the back, as the focal point, are framed. And so we can do that with plants. We can use plant shapes to create a frame as well. And I think most of us do think about how to connect that window view, you know, what you're looking at from the window with what you're looking at outside. So design principles guide our combination of plants, how we combine these shapes in our designs. And we're thinking about also the texture and the color, and introducing deciduous plants, grasses, perennials, which have even other characteristics. So these plants bring the visual and sensorial experience of a garden to the spaces that we're designing. And what are some of those senses that plants can bring? What really is it about plants that we love? And I think really, for me, and I think for a lot of gardeners and garden designers, you know, we have an emotional response to plants. And you know you're in trouble when you're petting and touching plants and staring at them and coveting them and stalking them and looking under them and Googling them. So I think plants are very compelling as objects, and they do bring out an emotional response. And how we combine them just furthers that emotional impact. So plants inspire an inner experience. This is a picture from a garden that I toured also on Long Island. And the use of grass waves, you know, so what kind of an impact does that have? Striking, unconventional, it's active. My eye is tracing those waves. This is a garden that I saw on the APLD tour in the California area some years ago. You know, the backyard of a private garden, which feels very cozy and intimate, visually rich. You know, a Japanese garden, very potentially quiet. Here's another Japanese garden, the Saihoji, the moss temple in Kyoto. But in the fall, you know, it morphs from something that is very quiet to something that has a lot of excitement and a lot of adventure and just a lot of energy and mystery, because you want to see what's next. Again, something very spare. So how we're combining plants, their shapes, thinking about their secondary characteristics, we really are able to create feelings with our planting plans. Here's that garden again. You know, it's tidy, but very floriferous. To me, I look at this and I just think high maintenance, resplendent. There's another garden that I've been working on for years with the homeowner. You know, verdant, well-balanced, soft, peaceful. You can see here just the use of shapes and how they're combined in the garden. This is a picture that I took off the internet, but just that gardens can really inspire awe. again, I think my next life I'm going to come back in the Southwest so that I can play with cactus. Just these shapes are just so compelling in majesty. This is not my backyard, just in case you're wondering. Here's a little person if you want to get a sense of scale. So we're coming to the end of my slides. So in summary, we've looked at plants as shapes, as forms, as objects, focusing on conifers in particular for this lecture. And it's the plants that add the visual and sensorial experience of a garden to our outdoor spaces. And it's design principles and guidelines that help us to select and cite and combine plant shapes in a way that's visually pleasing, as opposed to just trying to combine plants based on their flower or their color or their foliage when you're up close and personal with it. We're thinking about what is the shape first, how do those shapes combine, and then the additional bonus of thinking about the texture, the color, and that plants are compelling and they create emotional responses in the visitor and the viewer. And I think that's really what we're playing with, what our art form is using plants in ways to be compelling and to create some sort of emotional response for the visitor or the homeowner or whoever is going to be frequenting the garden space. So that is the end of my talk, and I'm going to now open things up for questions.
Thank you, Christie. That was wonderful. We have several questions. The first is, I'm a 74-year-old gardener and may not be able to put in as much time in future years. Does a native plant garden reduce the amount of work for maintenance?
I think more the question to be asked is what kind of plants require less maintenance? And certainly native plants, if used in places where they're happy, would require less maintenance. But it's also a matter of what is the style of the garden. So if the style of the garden is formal, no matter what kind of plants you use, if you want to have a very tidy, very formal looking garden, there really is no way around it requiring a lot of maintenance. But if you shift your garden style into something that is looser, less formal, maybe even some meadow type areas or areas where you're using plants that require minimal care, such as conifers, for instance, or areas that have grasses and perennials that you could mow once a year. I think it's more the style that's going to allow you to move into less maintenance rather than just thinking about what the plant is. Although it is true that a happy plant in the right a plant in the right spot is going to be a happy plant and require a lot less effort and energy. Good question.
Excellent. The next is a comment about one of your earlier slides. I love your diagonal line from the conifer. Any such plants can you suggest any such plants that would create a diagonal line for growing in zone 4A? I have a pool fence that I soften with Lonicera and Clematis and native grasses, but would love that diagonal effect.
So if I was thinking about conifers, certainly Norway spruce, I believe, would be hardy, and there are Norway spruce that are weepers that are that you're able to train. The Blue Atlas cedar is not an option for you. That would be more of an annual, which would be a very sad thing indeed. There's also weeping white pines, if that would be something that is hardy for you. There are some cultivars of weeping white pine where you have a central leader that is the weeping, that is the part that is weeping. And so just like I trained my weeping blue atlas cedar by training the leader, you could also, continue to train that each year as it puts on new growth. Thank you.
Okay. Since color is so important to beneficial pollinators, isn't that a consideration that you should take into account when doing a design?
I think that's a great point. So for me, it's like, how do you hold multiple pieces of data in your mind at the same time when you're making selections? So I think that even for me, with the use of pollinators, if I want to make sure that I'm introducing pollinator-friendly plants, I still want to think about what is the shape of the overall plant and how am I going to combine the shapes of these pollinator-friendly plants in a way that looks unified and pleasing. So it may be that the answer is to pick a few different types and really mass them in a way that and repeat them through the design such that helps to make the planting look well unified. So color is important, but I think color without thinking about what the plant itself looks like maybe not considering enough factors at one time. But thank you for bringing that up.
Okay. This comment is, I adore the Adolph gardens I've seen. Do you recommend any particular book?
So he has written, I believe with Noel Kingsbury, at least three books. So I would avail yourself of those. I think he also posts every day on Instagram. And there is a film that has come out recently that features him, and I'm not sure how to get a hold of that, but that would be another way of seeing some of his work. But yes, being there in person and seeing the gardens and experiencing them was just breathtaking.
Must have been wonderful. The next is, my garden designs encourage owners to snip here and there for vases. We call careful snips educational pruning to help maintain shrub or tree shapes and enjoy the snips inside later. Interesting design suggestion. The next is a question. I'm not all familiar with conifers. Does the spacing of the conifer collection garden that you showed in one of your earlier slides take into account the ultimate plant size? Or in the larger context, is it better to space out for immediate plant sizes and then deal with that?
Such a good point. And don't we spend most of our lives wishing that we had planted something farther apart or closer in, and moving plants? I think that for me, I am always thinking about how big is the plant going to be. And I do want to space the major plants, the bones of a planting design. I do want to space them such that they're not going to outgrow their space, really thinking about a window of 15, 20 years, even longer in cases. And my suggestion in that situation would be, rather than having big open areas of mulch like you did see in that photo, that I would plant some interim kind of companion plants that over time could be removed, or removed incrementally as the more dominant bones of the garden grow in. I think the photo that I showed you is an example of a collector who has purchased just the very baby plants of probably that are rare, and they planted them in that bed as a way of what we call growing them on, such that hopefully when they got a little bit larger and could be introduced into more of a garden situation, they would be introduced into a situation where there was more of a context. But I have seen conifer gardens where all of the plants have big areas of mulch around them, because the point for that person is to highlight their collection of objects, rather than to really think about it as a dynamic garden.
Very good point. Can you suggest deer-proof shade plants that would help to add shape variety in an area where other trees have matured and shaded out the plants from the original design?
So without seeing it, I'll just tell you one thing that comes to mind immediately that I ask myself, which is it unfair of me to think that a plant is going to do what I want in a certain growing situation? So there are times in certain situations where, we just expect too much from plants, and potentially in that situation, the idea is, okay, what non-plant objects could I use in this area to create visual interest? So thinking about the use of, maybe there's some containers that could have annuals in them. So maybe there's the use of sculpture, boulders, other types of non-plant living objects that provide that dynamic sense. There are conifers and certainly many plants that will grow in a lower light situation. But if you've already had the experience of the original planting dying out, and if that's happened on a wholesale basis, then it might behoove you to think about, is there a non-plant solution that I should be considering?
Okay, very good. Several very positive comments about wonderful slides. The next is, I like to use a pinch of color and prepare for fall impact and perhaps spring flowers, color and leaf formation to draw the eye through the year. How do you suggest planning designs for these changes?
So my lecture today, I really did rely on conifers as the way of illustrating how I think about plants as shapes. But absolutely, when I'm doing a planting design, I'm not just using conifers. I am using deciduous plants as well, thinking about ticking the boxes. So spring, summer, fall, and winter. I will say that for me, I think about, I really do think about my conifer selections and locations first, rather than just doing the whole planting design and then sticking in a couple conifers here and there. But absolutely, I'm thinking about, plants that are going to provide multiple seasons of interest, and how to get more than one season out of a plant. One thing that I'll say about conifers is that a lot of times people think of conifers as being very static. And we're coming up on the time of year where if you look at your conifers, you will see that their new growth often is a different color for spring color. And, you know, they offer, so they're not just a static thing that looks exactly the same year round, unless that's how they're being maintained. First question.
Good. The next is a comment and a question. This has been a great talk. Thank you, Christie. And the question is, in a front yard, is the house the focal point, or can you have additional focal points?
Such a good question. So I've worked with, so the ultimate goal in my mind is that the landscape and the house should look like they're related and they belong together. They should not look like they're fighting with each other, or that, you know, they're not friends. So for me, I've certainly worked with properties where the house actually is the focal point. You know, it has beautiful detailing, or it has kind of an elegance that we don't want to clutter, versus some houses really need help. They really do need something to give them a sense of character and give them a sense of interest. So I think that's really on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to a rule of thumb. So I would say look at the house and assess the house, and then think to yourself, do I need to really create something here, or do I need to simply enhance, and do I just need to enhance the house as it is?
Okay, very good. Given that we're supposed to get more precipitation and fluctuations due to climate change, what plants do you recommend that will best adapt to this climate?
So you might be surprised at my answer, but I do think of conifers as a good plant, thinking about global warming, in the sense that once established, conifers pretty much across the board are quite drought tolerant, and many are able to cope with higher temperatures and sun. And if planted well, such that they're not in a poorly drained area, which is more of a site concern. So if you deal with those site problems before doing your planting, I think conifers are a great plant category to consider. And I think there's probably a lot of plant lists available online of plants that seem to be able to tolerate the extremes that we're getting.
Okay, very good. Since conifers are a favorite of yours, do you have advice for the fungus that's impacting so many, or the other problems that conifers seem to be running into now?
So I think the question is there a way to, how do you use any plant responsibly? And certainly there are more and more pests and diseases that are affecting all kinds of plants. So again, I go back to right plant, right place, and also thinking about what plants appear to be more resilient than others, and not picking plants that, are under attack by multiple potential problems. So I think that the proper selection of plants goes back to really having an understanding of what is the site, what are plants that are going to do well there, that are going to thrive and not either be stressed by the situation or that appear to be too delicious and vulnerable to consider even including to begin with. So I don't have a particular answer as it relates to conifers, but I am thoughtful about what conifers I'm using. And like, for instance, I'm not using hemlocks. So thinking about which of the conifer genus appear to be more pest resistant than others.
Okay, good advice. Which conifers do well in shady areas under large deciduous trees?
So thinking about that kind of a situation, Taxus, Cephalotaxus, Chamaecyparis can be a possible plant, boxwood, Ilex crenata, which are not conifers, but are broadleaf evergreens. So thinking about, and some white pine. So those would be the genus that I'd be thinking about. I wouldn't use anything that is that has a blue foliage or yellow, has a yellow foliage in a very shady situation.
Okay, very good. If you wanted to create a visual as well as wind block between properties, is there something that you could recommend other than arborvitaes?
So you may not know this, but I've taken like 9,000 photos of arborvitaes, and because I do find, I don't take pictures of individual arborvitaes. I take pictures where they've been used in, as long rows, because a lot of times they do look. It's A for effort, but maybe the ultimate goal is not achieved with the arborvitaes. So the first thing that I would think of in doing a privacy screen or a wind screen is to think about what's the size, what's the space that's available to me, both width and height. What's the conditions that we're looking at? And for me, more than planting a row of all of the same thing in a marched, in a forced march, I really do think about how to create more of a varied, more of a varied plant approach. And when I'm thinking about privacy, I encourage whoever the person is that wants privacy to look at the area that bugs them and really pinpoint the one or two spots that are particularly awful, and then figure out a solution for those one or two particularly terrible spots, because that's the spot that really needs an evergreen, versus the areas on either side of it that may not be. You may still want to have a sense of separation, but 100% privacy may not be necessary. So I try to think thoughtfully about where do I really need 100% privacy versus a sense of separation. Think about the environmental characteristics, and then try to do something that offers more visual interest.
Okay, very good. Do you plan your own tours to the gardens that you visit all over the world, or do you recommend any tour company?
So I do not, plan my own tours. I will say that Carex Tours, Carex Tours, is run by a garden designer who has put together garden tours. And that is the tour that I went on to see the Pete Oudoff gardens last summer. So I don't think she's running tours this year, but For me, having a garden designer be the person that picked the gardens to tour really made the tour very, very, just really packed a punch.
Excellent. Great suggestion. What a lovely walk in the garden this has been, Christie. Thank you so much for sharing all of these insights and creativity to inspire us all to transform our own designs and our own gardens into living works of art too. So thank you again for this wonderful presentation.
Okay, thank you all for coming out of the sun and sitting and watching this, and I hope that you take something away.